Mr. Chappell? Here he is. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a technology conference, right? I'm going to talk about technology. But before I do, let me tell you a story. I travel a lot. It's the nature of what I do. I fly around, I give talks about technology and business. Not too long ago, I was in Vienna, where I gave the opening keynote for a day of events at which the closing keynote was given by Bill Gates. And because I did the opening keynote, they asked me to introduce Bill at the end. And I said, sure. So before Bill's keynote, I go backstage, we shake hands, and Bill says, should I shake David's hand after the introduction? That's the usual thing. I just had my hand shaken right now. It's the usual thing. But the event organizer said to Bill, he said, Bill, don't shake David's hand. Keep it simple. And Bill said, okay. And I said, okay. And I walk on stage. It's an enormous room. 1,000 people and the entire Austrian press corps are there in Vienna to hear Bill Gates. I walk on stage. I get the warmest applause of my entire life because for just a moment they think I'm Bill. They realize I'm not Bill, they stop clapping. Okay. I do my intro. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Gates. And Bill starts walking on, I start walking off. It's an enormous stage. It's a huge stage, much bigger than this. I'm walking off, Bill's walking toward me. As Bill walks toward me, what does he do? He raises his hand. I'm thinking, we agreed not to shake hands. But if Bill Gates wants to shake my hand, I will shake his hand. So I raise my hand and we're walking. But just as I raise my hand, I look in Bill's eyes, I can see him remember, oh wait, we agreed not to do this. So just as I raise my hand, Bill drops his hand, and I drop my hand, and I slink by, having just been snubbed by Bill Gates in front of 1,000 people and the entire Austrian press corps. This is a true story. Why did this happen? It happened because change is hard. Change is hard. Even little changes, like not shaking hands, the usual thing on the intro, for smart people like Bill Gates probably is, was hard. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, what is it that we have to do every year, every month, every week, every day it sometimes feels like in our profession? You know the answer. We have to change. I'm here this morning to talk about what I believe is the biggest change happening in our industry today. It's the rise of cloud computing. So, let's talk about this. What do organizations look like that aren't using cloud computing? That's probably many of you today, maybe even most of you today. If you don't use cloud computing, you have your own data center on premises in your organization somewhere with your own computing and storage and network, and you run applications on those systems. Now, some of those applications, probably lots of them, run inside virtual machines, VMs, not right on your servers. For those of you who aren't into the technology here, briefly, a virtual machine is a software emulation of a physical computer. Applications run inside VMs as if they were physical machines. I can run lots of VMs on one physical machine, which is a good thing to do. So that's how data centers look today, right? Cloud computing can potentially change this in three ways. First, I can use applications that run in the cloud. It is common to refer to this as software as a service, SaaS. Second, I can use cloud platforms. I can use public cloud platforms. Let me run my applications and store data out there in the cloud somewhere. Third, I can use what are commonly called private clouds, which are in essence cloud platforms I put in my own organization. Now I got to stop right here, because do you see surveys from the various companies that do this kind of thing telling us that by 2000 whatever, 80% of IT spending will be in the cloud. Do you see those surveys? You need to appreciate what garbage those are. Because in the cloud, what does that mean? These are three very different things. So when you see surveys that talk about cloud computing, recognize there's a lot of blurriness there. It's much more effective to break things down into three categories like this. They're quite different. And here's what they mean. In a world with cloud computing, we still, of course, are running applications in our own environments. Even in a world of cloud computing, we're going to have on-premises data centers. Absolutely. However, we now have to think about things running externally at other service providers, cloud providers. We might, for example, use an application or many applications running out there, SaaS applications. We might use a public cloud platform, which effectively runs our applications in VM, somebody else's data center. Or we might adopt some of the technologies of the public cloud platform. I'll show you an example of those in a minute, and use those in our own data center for private cloud. All of those things qualify under the broad heading of cloud computing. What are some examples? Well, in the world of SaaS, you might have heard of things like Office 365, Dynamics CRM Online. Those are technologies offered by Microsoft. Let me tell you something. Microsoft brought me here today, so my examples will all be from Microsoft. What a coincidence. But it turns out there are lots of vendors in this space, obviously. Okay? So, I'm not going to focus on SaaS. I'm not going to focus on cloud applications. I'm going to focus instead on this part of the story, on the public cloud platform and the private cloud platform. Okay? Let's go. Forgive me here. I was listening to the earlier presentations through the very fine interpreters, and I thought, oh my God, my talk is about technology. I felt like I was not in the right place necessarily, so forgive me, right? We're going to drop into a little bit of technology and then appear up from that again, okay? But I've got to do a little bit of technology to make sense out of what follows. So, in organizations today, applications are commonly run in virtual machines, these software emulations of real servers. How do I get a new virtual machine if I want one in my company? Well, the usual model today is if somebody wants a virtual machine, they ask somebody else. They ask the person whose job it is to administer VMs. They say, please give me a new VM. And that person goes through some process to decide whether or not they should get their VM. If the answer is yes, they use a VM management tool to create the VM they asked for on some physical server. Great. Whether you know it or not, this happens regularly inside your organization, I promise you. One of the key changes that cloud technology brings is to automate that process. Cloud technology, the areas that we're looking at this morning, revolve around something called infrastructure as a service, IaaS. Americans commonly pronounce this as IaaS. I'm American, I'll say IaaS. Here in Greece, I'm told it's pronounced IaaS or something more like that. Is that correct? I'm not sure, okay? I'm going to say IaaS, so please bear with me here. With IaaS, my user has the same problem. She wants a virtual machine. But what does she do now? She has software to do it for her. She has access to this thing called a self-service portal. That's a fancy name for a website. Access to a website that lets her look at a bunch of images of potential VMs. A VM running Windows or Linux or something else. She chooses one and she says, give me one of those. And the software creates it for her on some machine. That's what IaaS means. IaaS means self-service VMs running on pooled hardware. Turns out that that is a fundamental aspect of cloud computing. And here's why. If I do IaaS in my own data center, people call that a private cloud. If I do IaaS in some big external data center owned by somebody else, People call that a public cloud. Great. The thing to realize here is that private and public clouds do very different things. Private clouds help you make your own data centers better, more effective, more efficient. Public clouds give you access to these massive external data centers with huge scale and usage-based pricing. You pay for your virtual machines by the hour, typically. You pay as you go. Those are very different things. In fact, I got to tell you something. If I ruled the world, which I don't, obviously, but if I ruled the world, I would hunt down the person who coined the term private cloud, and I would shoot them. Because it is so darn confusing. It is really confusing. But it's common. These terms are commonly used. We can't get rid of them yet. So, I want to be clear about this, though, that there's an enormous difference between private cloud and public cloud. Here are three truths about these things. Truth number one, private and public clouds have similar technology. They're both rooted in IaaS, but they offer very different benefits, as I just showed you. Because of this, people often ask, should I use a private cloud or a public cloud? But this is the wrong question. You want to think and, not or. The truth is that many, maybe even most organizations are going to want both. I'll describe why in a couple of minutes here. And finally, if I'm going to have both private and public clouds, then how well they work together, how well they integrate is really important. Let's look a little more at this private-public cloud thing. Because if you think about something, if you think about what organizations want for data centers, I think you'll probably agree with me that pretty much all organizations want three things. Everybody who has a data center, which is probably all of you in this room, you want better data centers. You want them to be cheaper and faster and easier to use. But more than that, what most organizations really want is not just better data centers. They want fewer data centers. Tell me, find me the CEO of a non-technology company who's happy about writing checks for data centers. They hate data centers. Actually, they hate IT to a great extent, but that's a separate topic, right? They don't want to do this. They don't want to run data centers. And so fewer data centers, thus more use of public cloud platforms, is a viable thing. And finally, the third thing, of course, is the connection. If people are going to have both private and public clouds, how they work together is important. So, let's talk about these things. Private clouds. Private clouds. What do you get from private clouds? Well, you get this automated, easier deployment of VMs. I showed you that earlier, that thing called IaaS. What else do you get? You might be able to deploy more than just VMs, complete applications, and even do things like automate your environment to find and fix problems automatically and more. What's an example of a private cloud technology? Microsoft has a thing called System Center 2012. One example. Why would you want to use a private cloud? What are the pros and cons of private clouds? Let's walk through them quickly. You can do things faster because you automated deployment. That's a good thing. You have lower costs because you have automated deployment. You have fewer errors because you have, say it with me, automated deployment. Right? Automation's a big part of the story. It's a big part of private cloud. And you might be able to do better cost management because you can charge per VM and bill people. Those are all ways in which private clouds can make data centers better. What are the risks of private clouds? Well, they're not huge. Remember that person I showed you in my diagram whose job it was to allocate those VMs? If you tell them that you're now going to let users do their own VM allocation, he or she is going to say, really? I'm going to trust the great unwashed like you to do this yourself? It makes them nervous. Also, they might say, automate my job? I don't think so. They don't like that. And it can be hard to define standard services and a few more things. The point is that private clouds can have real benefits for some organizations. The downsides are really relatively small. And what I am seeing is that almost every organization that gets value, that could get value from private clouds, is doing them. They make very good sense. But you know what? Private clouds aren't where the big change is. The big change in cloud computing comes not from private clouds, it comes from public clouds. So let's talk for a little while about public clouds. This is the real game changer here. And so remember, public clouds potentially let organizations that are not fundamentally IT companies have fewer data centers. Rather than run their applications storing their data in their own data centers, they let this happen at external data centers. There's a really good analogy here with something else that happened in history. And here's what it is. If you jump back 120, 140, 150 years to the early days when factories were first being electrified, what you see is that factories all ran their own generators to power the electric motors. They had to. They had to. Then what happened? Over time, centralized power utilities grew up that provided central power for all the factories, all the homes, the whole city. And factories dismantled their own generators. Why? They wanted the power. They don't want to run generators. The analogy here with cloud computing, public cloud computing, is fairly obvious, is it not? Today, banks, insurance companies, retailers, manufacturing firms, airlines, shipping companies, all run their own data centers. All they want are the applications. If they could run those things at some centralized location for a lot less money, it would make sense. So the rise of public cloud computing is in many ways analogous to the rise of public utilities for power. There's a bunch of concrete scenarios here. You can deploy VMs more effectively. You can give developers an easy way to create applications, a dev test environment. You can deploy your applications using these pay-as-you-go resources. You need not pony up a bunch of money for a big server. You can just rent VMs by the hour as you need them. Lower cost storage and more. I live outside San Francisco. If you go to a Silicon Valley venture capitalist and ask for money for a new startup company, and part of the money you ask for is meant for a big data center, even a small data center, they will laugh you out of the room. The assumption today in startup land is that everybody always uses the cloud. Why should only startups have this benefit? They should not. They should not. And so public cloud computing, an example of which is Microsoft's Windows Azure, has a bunch of benefits. There's a bunch of reasons why this can make sense for organizations. You can deploy things immediately. You want new computing resources? Go to the public cloud. You can get your VM, get your storage in 5 or 10 minutes. As opposed to ordering new servers, new storage, waiting for installation, waiting for all that stuff to happen. 10 minutes. That's a good thing. You get usage-based pricing, which means you've got no commitment. If you're a startup with limited money, you start in the public cloud. If your business fails, like most startups do, you just shut things down and stop paying. This is great. It leaves the startup more money for their next stupid idea or their next bright idea, whatever. Okay? The point here is that you are able to pay as you go and not commit up front. That's a good thing. Reduce need for on-premises resources. That's a good thing for many businesses. They do not want to run data centers. Easier upgrades. Great. I'm willing to bet that some number of you agree with me that there are a set of benefits from public cloud platforms. I'm also willing to bet that I know what you're all thinking right now, every single one of you. What you're thinking is, yeah, there are some benefits, yeah, this idea of a common utility that's much, much lower cost can make some sense. But man, aren't there some really big negatives here as well? Aren't there some really enormous risks that we should talk about? The answer is, you bet there are. Let's talk about them. Number one, using a public cloud platform requires that you trust the provider. Now, people often think about this in terms of security. They say, well, if I use a public cloud platform and the data center is in Amsterdam or Dublin and I'm here in Athens, how in the world can I be sure they have good security? Well, the thing is, with public cloud providers, they will not let you go in and check things like their firewall settings. You can't do that. You have to trust them. You have to build trust in public cloud providers. How do we build trust? Answer, slowly. People start small and build from there. Let me ask, who in the room is using any cloud application today? Anything at all? A bunch of you. I bet all of you really are. You all use Facebook, don't you? You all use LinkedIn? Who in the room uses Dropbox or SkyDrive? Right. Those run on cloud platforms, right? You're already using a public cloud platform here, right? So the truth is, those small steps are what build trust in the cloud because you find the benefits have some value, the downsides aren't huge, and you move forward. And they're so attractive price-wise. You know, in public cloud platforms, the big players in this space, people like Microsoft and others, are building these massive data centers, and they are competing against each other to sell you what? To sell you awfully darn generic services, virtual machines, storage, things that are virtually commoditized. What happens when giant competitors compete at scale to sell you commoditized things? Answer, prices drop to costs. Prices drop to the floor. This is the heart of the argument for why people like me believe that over the next 5, 10, 15 years, public cloud platforms will come to dominate. Because you'll learn to trust, as many of you already have, and the price advantage will be so enormous. But you know, people are irrational about trust. They're just irrational. I'll meet with the CIO and discuss this, and he'll say, I would never put things on a public cloud platform. And then he'll send me some slides via his Dropbox account. Right? People are irrational. Or here's a better example. What is the world's scariest technology? Is the world's scariest technology nuclear weapons? Is the world's scariest technology the Stuxnet virus that attacked Iran? No, no. The world's scariest technology is Windows Update. Think about this. Every Patch Tuesday, you let Microsoft put in your operating system whatever code it feels like. How do you know that code is not stealing your data? Answer, you don't. You trust them. If the government of North Korea tomorrow purchased all the assets of the Microsoft Corporation, what would you do? I hope you would all turn off Windows Update. I sure would. My point here is we are irrational about trust. You already have more trust in vendors like Microsoft than they ask you to put in their cloud platform because they're in your operating system. Suppose that you trust these cloud platforms. Next question is this. Aren't there laws about this stuff? Aren't there regulations about this? And the answer is yes. This is a hard issue because those regulations differ across vertical markets and across countries, and to a great extent they were created before the cloud existed. And so they can be very hard to apply to the modern world of cloud computing. Objective, no. Subjective, yes. Difficult. What do you do about this? Well, my experience here is diverse. When I talk with organizations that have actually looked into this in detail, many find a majority in my experience, find that they can use more of their data in the public cloud than they thought they could. But think about this. When you think about the public cloud, you probably think first about your most secure, most critical, most secret data, right? But the truth is, everyone has a continuum of data, from most secure to public. I would encourage you, if you find this interesting, to start over here. We heard an earlier speaker talking about the importance of public data. I wholly agree. And public cloud platforms are a great match, a great place to start with public data, because there aren't the security and regulatory worries that you might have with, say, financial data or personal information. What else? Integration can be harder sometimes, and performance can be an issue. Not of the apps themselves, but the network communication relies on last mile connectivity. And some countries have slower last mile connections than others, I'm told. So that can be an issue sometimes. One more thing. Cloud computing, public cloud computing, often makes IT people think but rarely say this last question: am I going to lose my job? Let me tell you, if you're a developer who writes code, doesn't matter at all. Your code runs on-premises, public cloud, so what? If you're an IT leader, a CIO, a manager, it's not going to affect you. You'll now start managing more outsourced projects, outsourced infrastructure. You'll still have a job. If you are an IT administrator, your job is, let's say, administering Exchange servers all day. Yeah. Who in the room uses cloud-based email today? Cloud-based email. Right, I should have asked who doesn't, because cloud email is the norm these days. So people whose career is about administering on-premises email servers don't have much of a future. In that role, will you fire them? Of course not. They get retrained, repurposed. This does not mean that jobs go away. It means that roles change. Anybody who works in IT who thought one set of skills would see them through their entire career was deeply mistaken. People who do not like change should not work in technology. Do you agree? All right. The last point here, integration. Just an example, again, using randomly Microsoft technologies. The thing called System Center lets you create VMs, monitor apps, automate with private clouds and with public clouds like Windows Azure. The notion of tying these together is important. As I said earlier, organizations are going to want both. So integration matters across the board. Where should you start? This is my last slide, by the way. Where should you start? For private clouds, as I said earlier, if what private clouds bring you has value, if the automation you see here has value, do it. The restrictions, the limitations, the risks are not big at all. For public cloud platforms, it's harder. We got to build trust, deal with regulations. The most common places people start with public cloud platforms are a dev test environment where their developers can use virtual machines in the cloud to build apps. Why is this good? Because they commonly don't use real data during development. And so regulatory concerns are not a big deal. The other area people start with is storage, where you can use cloud storage, encrypted cloud storage, where only you hold the key to get much lower cost. And finally, keep integration in mind. You always care about how you connect these things. Two last thoughts. First of all, it's too big a group, and I have too little time to do Q&A, which is a shame, because I'd love to talk with you more. I'll be here for a while, so if you have questions, come talk to me. I'd love to hear your perspective. Right? Second, my final thought. It's probably obvious, but I want to leave you with this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the future. Thank you.